The Princess of the Chalet School. Chapter 21. The Escape. Jo was so worn out that she slept soundly, in spite of the knowledge that Cosimo and his jackal lay within a few meters of her, and that the most difficult part was still to come. She guessed that it had taken the two men all their time to get Elisaveta to this place. However, she was going to get the child back was a problem that might have puzzled wiser heads than hers, but she snuggled down under the rock wall and slept as only a tired child can sleep. Rufus, who had also borne the burden of the day, slumbered profoundly, and it was the early dawn when he awoke. Jo was still far away, and when the big dog moved and stretched himself, she never stirred. With the rising of the sun, Prince Cosimo set out for the pass and the little village of Medirin Riz on the Isar, where he hoped to get a boatman to take him as far as possible to Tolls, where he intended to get the train to Munich. From Munich, if things went badly, it would be easy for him to go on to Schwarzwald, where his foster mother lived, one of the very few beings who loved him. She, as he knew, would do anything for him, and he was relying on her to help him in his disgraceful plans. The dark shadows of the western slopes of the mountain still held the Alm in their grip, and he passed the dog and the child without even suspecting that they were there. Clad in his well-worn jaguar costume, with his face half hidden in a heavy beard and his hair down to his shoulders, there was little to connect him with Prince Cosimo of Monte Carlo and Paris and Vienna, who had earned for himself the reputation of being one of the best-dressed young men in Europe. He swung, whistling over the crisp grass, and set off down the path while Joey and Rufus slept the sleep of the weary, while Ternakey yawned widely and went back to his bundle of hay in the cave where they had sheltered the night before, and while Elisaveta tossed uneasily on the heap of rugs they had arranged for a bed for her, muttering continually in her sleep. Rufus, being of a hardy breed, needed less slumber than anyone else, and before the dew was off the grass, he had roused up, stretched himself, and then gone to the stream to get a drink of water. Joey was the next to waken. It seemed to her as if she were coming up from a deep silence. Then she heard the faint tinkling of cowbells from the valley far below, and sat up suddenly, bumping her head with considerable force against the low roof of the little hollow in which she had been curled up. "Blow," she remarked very definitely. Then she looked round. Rufus was standing beside her, wagging his tail, and looking very pleased with himself. Joey flung an arm round his neck. "Where have you been, you old scoundrel?" she asked, hugging him. He bestowed a wide and wet kiss on her face, and she drew back. "I love you, old thing, but I don't love your kisses. I wonder what we can catch for breakfast. Shouldn't think there'd be much up here." She got up cautiously, listening for any sound, but Signor Ternakey was tired. He knew that Elisaveta couldn't possibly get away from there unaided, and he saw no reason why he should not make up for lost time. Joey was stiff and sore after yesterday's strenuous work, but she plunged her head and face in the stream and soon felt better. Food for herself was not so hard to find as she had feared, for she presently came to a small patch of wild strawberries, and as there were plenty of ripe ones, she had a good feast. Rufus was another matter, however. He couldn't eat fruit, and she felt worried about him. Rufus settled the matter himself. He found a baby rock rabbit, and it vanished down his throat in 2 mouthfuls before his horrified mistress could prevent it. "You old cannibal," she said. "How could you? It was only a baby, too." Rufus wagged his tail apologetically. He looked ashamed of himself, though he really could not see why she was vexed with him. It was only a rabbit, and there were thousands of them, and he was hungry. "Never mind, old boy. You had to eat something, didn't you? Said Joey. Then she got up from the ground where she had been sitting and went on to the southeast of the mountain, where the elm ended in bare mountain slope strewn with boulders. Joe looked at it consideringly. I wonder if we could get down there instead of going by the path, she said aloud. If we could only get down to where the forest begins, we could soon get home. It wouldn't be a big lift, too. It would cut off all the parts of the pass. Then her mind wandered to her sister. I hope they found my signs all right, she said to Rufus. However, she knew that she must not rely on this too much. She must be prepared to do something herself. The question was, what? She looked down the steep side of the mountain again. It would be difficult, she thought, but not impossible. Finally, she decided to get back to Elisaveta and see how she was to get her friend away from Cosimo and Tarniki. How she was to do that, Joey had not the least idea. She supposed she should think of something when the time came. She turned and went back the way she had come. She had just reached the stream when she suddenly stopped. There was her friend, washing her face in the water. Neither Cosimo nor his underling was there. Joey suspected a trap. With a word to the dog, which he obeyed at once, she dropped to the ground and lay still. Elisaveta finished her ablutions and then stood up, tossing back the long curls from her face as she wiped her hands on a big handkerchief. No one came to her, so Joey decided to risk something. She lifted herself very little and uttered a low, "Cooey." Elisaveta heard and promptly turned and stared so plainly in the direction it had come from that if anyone had been with her, he must have noticed it at once. No one was there, however, so it didn't matter. But Joey resolved to give her friend lessons in the art of concealment as soon as possible. Now she raised her hand and rapidly morrised, "All's well." Then she sank back. She had done what she could. It was up to Elisaveta to make the next move. The princess took a look round, and then she leapt over the stream and came running to Joey, who wriggled in serpentine fashion towards the rock. Elisaveta followed her, and presently they were both safely in the shadow. "Will they miss you?" asked Joe. Elisaveta shook her head. "Cosimo went away this morning, and Tarniki sleeps even now," she said. "Can you climb?" asked Joey. "A little. I'm tired, but I don't mind that. Oh, Joey, help me to get away now, before they can do anything to Daddy. I heard them talking last night. I couldn't hear all they said, but I heard enough to know that Cosimo has some horrid plan of making Grandpapa and Daddy give him what he wants, and saying they will hurt me if they don't. Let's go at once, Joey." Joey looked at her doubtfully. Elisaveta looked very white and tired, and not fit for the scramble they would have if they went by the way she had chosen. Still, it might make difficulties if Cosimo got in his messages first, so she made up her mind to risk it. "All right," she said. "Come on." They set off, Rufus galloping on ahead. Joey had the good sense to insist on their keeping close to the wall, so they were not seen when a badly scared Tarniki came rushing out to the edge of the little plateau and stared along to see if the princess, whom he had just missed on awakening, were there. He did not see them, so he hurried back to the cave to get his boots and his coat, before hastening along to the full extent of the elm to find her. By the time he had emerged once more, the two children had gone over the edge, near the wild strawberry bed, at a spot Joe had noticed on coming back. It was a very little easier than the way at the end of the elm, for it had one or two naked tree trunks springing out of the earth, and she reckoned they could help themselves with them. It never dawned on the man to look over. He fully expected to find the child wandering about the elm, and that she would try to escape he didn't dream for 1 minute. So he hurried past them at full speed, calling loudly to her while they were scrambling and slipping down the bare rock slope, Elisaveta clinging to Joe and Joe holding fast to Rufus's mane. The dog chose the easiest way, and although they were bumped and scratched and bruised, they were managing to get down in some fashion. Tarniki, finding nothing when he arrived at the southeastern extremity of the elm, was horrified. To do him justice, he was afraid that Princess must have tried to get away by the path up which they had brought her the previous evening, and in that case she would certainly hurt herself, perhaps badly. He tore back to the head of it, calling, "Highness, Princess, answer me!" By the time he had reached it, the two children had gone halfway down the bare slope, and had reached the worst bit of their journey. "How on earth are we going to get down there?" demanded Elisaveta. "There's not an atom of foothold, Joey. It looks rather as if we should have to roll." "We won't do that if we can help it," declared Joey. "I want a little skin left on me, thank you. Now what shall we do?" It certainly was a nasty place. The ground had broken off here, and there was a precipitous drop of some 10 feet. If they had had a rope, it would have been all right, but they hadn't. However, no guide was going to be done that way. "Take off your stockings," Joey ordered, sitting down and taking off her own. When she had the 2 pairs before her, she produced her knife, slit them up, and then she tied the pieces together with reef knots, which have the advantage of pulling tighter the more strain you put on them. Still, that was not nearly long enough. They would land on a fairly steep slope, and they dared not risk a drop. "Our clothes," suggested Elisaveta. Joey shook her head. "No, I don't think we'd better do that. People might have fits if we wander into Brassau in our knickers." This was true, that the princess said no more, but cast about in her mind for some substitute. "What about our vests?" she said. Joey brightened up at once. "Good scheme." Off came the vests, and the knife came into use again, and they had ropes just long enough. It looked frail, but neither was very big, and both were thin, so they hoped for the best. "I'll wind it round this stump to get a purchase on it," said Joey, "and then you go down first, and I'll follow. Rufus must scramble. Luckily, he's used to it, so it won't matter so much." Elisaveta obeyed without a word. They had done rope climbing in their gym, so she was able to get down very well on the whole. She had to drop a couple of feet, but she managed to steady herself against a piece of rock that jutted out. Then she called to Joey. "It's all right, Joey. Come down." Joe proceeded to knot the impoverished rope round the rock, and then she took a deep breath and let herself down. It was a risky proceeding, for the rope was wearing thin, but there was nothing else for it. She had got halfway down when it suddenly gave and she fell. Luckily, Elisaveta kept her head. Clutching at her rock with one hand, she grabbed Joey's clothes with the other and managed to check her fall. Joe bumped her elbow badly and scratched her face, but she got onto her feet and leant against Elisaveta for a moment. Up above, Rufus was whining unhappily. He wanted to get to his mistress, but he did not see how he was to do it. Joey, fully recovered, looked up at him. "Come along, old man," she called. "Woof, woof," bayed Rufus. Then, like the girls, he decided to make the best of a bad job. There was a flurry and a scramble, and a young earthquake came sliding down on top of them. They both screamed and grabbed at his long, hairy jacket. A minute more, and they were all 3 standing on the narrow ledge, shaky but safe. After it was a comparatively easy matter to climb down the slope, still clinging together until they came to one of the little wayside streams which bubbled up out of the earth on all sides in the district. They stopped here, and all three drank. They took off their shoes and bathed their feet, as well as their hands and faces. And then Joey stood up and took her bearings. "The sun is nearly overhead," she said, looking down at her shadow. "That means it's about noon. I think we had better go on till we get to the forest, and then rest a bit. We ought to find blueberrying there, so we ought to get something to eat. I don't know about you, but I could eat an elephant. I'm so hungry." "I don't think I'm as hungry as all that," replied Elizaveta. "I'm so tired, Joey. Do you think it will be long before we get back to the school?" Joey shook her head. "Couldn't say. You see, I don't know how far along the pass we are. We must be a good way along, but I don't know how much, and we may have to go back when we are going through the wood. I don't know this part at all." She looked at her friend anxiously as she said this. Elizaveta was very white, and it was plain, even to Joey's inexperienced eyes, that she couldn't stand a great deal more. Her severe illness in the early part of the year had sapped her strength, and she had not very fully recovered. Also, she was less accustomed to standing on her own feet than Joey, and the experience of the last 2 days had told on her. Joey held out her hand to the princess. "Come along, Veta," she said coaxingly. "We can't stand here. It's too open. There'll be shelter in the woods, and we can have a sleep. Rufus won't let anyone touch us, so it'll all be quite all right." Elizaveta remembered that she was a princess, and that princesses must keep up when it is necessary. Besides, the thought of what her father would suffer if he got his cousin's demands before the wire Miss Bettany would be sure to send, once they were safely back at school, helped to spur her on. Joey had her own reasons for wanting to get back as quickly as possible. For the first time since the adventure had begun, she was beginning to doubt if she had done quite right in going off by herself, as she had done. She only hoped that Madge had not worried too much, and it was a forlorn hope. As for Rufus, adventures were all very well, but he had had enough for one time. What he wanted was his comfortable shed and the big plate of meat and bones his own servant, Marie, always prepared for him once a day. All three, therefore, were anxious to finish with this and get back to safety once more. They went on very slowly, for the two little girls were footsore and weary, and at length came to the wood. It was cool and pleasant under the tree, and the ground, carpeted with pine needles, was soft to their feet after the hard way they had come. Joey led the way to a little clearing where the ground looked dry and warm, and they sank down beside the fallen trunk of a tree. Elizaveta fell asleep almost at once, with her head on Joey's lap, and Jo herself was not long in following her example. They slept for 2 hours. Then Rufus woke them up by baying lustily. Joey woke in a fright. She thought that Cosimo and Tarniki must have got on their track, but it was only a bird that had flown rather near, disturbing the big dog. The sun showed that it was long past cafe, and Jo decided that they must go home that night. She shook Elizaveta awake, and they set out at once more. It wasn't so far from where they had come to the head of the pass, and though they did not know it, help was very near. Joey left the guiding part of the business to Rufus, trusting to the dog's wisdom to get them on the road. She did wisely in doing this. Rufus led them straight to the edge of the forest, and they found themselves on the pass, just above the valley. "Come on," said Joey with some return of briskness, when she discovered this. "We shall soon be home now." They made what haste they could, and then, just as they had reached a bend in the road, there came a sound that was sweeter than the sweetest music in Joe's ears. A man's voice said, "Don't worry, madame. We will take you back, for you are worn out. And then Russell and I will come back and look till we find them. I promise it." The dearest voice in all the world answered him, "You are very kind, Captain Trevelyan, but I cannot go back till I know they are both safe." "Madge!" Joey did not pause to consider how she had got there. Grabbing at Elizaveta, she rushed forward. "Madge!" she cried. "Madge! We're here! We're safe!" Someone caught the princess from her grasp, and she tripped on a stone and fell forward into a very haven of safety, Madge's arms. She was held closely to her sister, kisses were literally showered on her face, and Madge's voice cried, "Safe at last! Oh, thank God! Thank God!" Chapter 22, The Return to School. "Joey, baby." Joey, laying nestled in her sister's arm, looked up. "Madge, it's so nice to be with you again. I sometimes thought I was never get back to you. Once or twice when we were coming down the mountain and we slipped, I thought it was going to be the wind up." Madge held the child tightly to her. "We won't say anything about it, Joey. I don't want even to think of it." Joe's eyes darted swiftly to her sister's face. "It has been bad?" Jim Russell spoke authoritatively at once. "Joe, you're not to talk about it at all. Why can't you follow Elizaveta's example?" He glanced down at the little princess who was laying sound asleep in his arms. Joey shook her head. "I can't." "Well, don't talk at any rate." Joey lay quiet, but Madge, holding her, could feel her heart beating rapidly, and naturally felt very anxious about it. If Joey were to be ill, she didn't know what she would do. She felt that she could stand nothing more. It was a relief when they came to the road that led to the lake shore, for that meant that they would soon be home now. It was growing late, and the dusk had fallen when they finally arrived at the gate of the school. Captain Trevelyan wanted to take the child from Madge, but she refused. "She's wide awake, and I think she would rather walk, wouldn't you, Joe?" Joey nodded as she was put down. She felt dreadfully tired, and she was beginning to wonder if she would ever leave off aching, but she had enough go left in her to walk up the path and into the house. She looked round at the dear familiar surroundings with a deep sigh. "How lovely it is," she said involuntarily. Madge smiled. "It's home, isn't it, Joey? Come along, you and Elizaveta must have something to eat and then get off to bed at once." "Rufus, too," said Joey. "He's been a hero. I could never have got Elizaveta away if he hadn't been for him." "Rufus shall have as much as ever he can eat," returned her sister, pulling one of his soft ears. "I shall love Rufus always for this." Dr. Jem had carried Elizaveta into the house by this time and laid her on the couch in the study. Now he came back for Joey. She refused to let him carry her, but he insisted on her going in at once. Marie was ready for them, and the big bowls of soup, and when they had taken this, they were packed off to bed. The princess, who had to waken before they could get her to take her soup, was to go into the sanatorium with Miss Maynard, while Joe was to share her sister's room. The doctor thought it better that they should be separated for a day or two. He felt anxious about them, particularly Joey, who was highly excitable and easily ran a temperature. Elizaveta was so tired that she fell asleep and never awakened when Miss Maynard tucked her up comfortably. Captain Trevelyan waited until he was allowed to see her fast asleep in bed, and then he went off to Eben, where his aeroplane mechanic, who had come with him, were waiting for him. It was a beautifully fine night, with blazing stars and bright moon to come up later on. He hoped to be in Fierato very shortly and be able to relieve the anxiety of the king himself. In case anything delayed him, Madge was to wire to the Crown Prince's secretary in the morning a message which would tell no one outside anything. Above all, it was hoped that anybody but the people most concerned would ever get to know of this outrage of Prince Cosimo. "Do you think they will leave the princess here after all that has happened?" asked Miss Bethany. "If you will consent to keep her," replied the captain. "I think nothing is more likely. She is terribly tired just now, of course, but it is easy to see that she has gained enormously under your care, and I do not think Cosimo is likely to make another attempt to kidnap her. If I know anything of Ridolfo," he added grimly, "I should say that he will have Cosimo quietly disposed of in one of the fortresses. He must be mad. As I told Dr. Russell, there is a kink in his brain, and if he were anybody but a prince, he would have been shut up long ago. You need have no further anxiety on that account." "I am glad to know that," she said simply. "His Majesty will doubtless send an envoy to see you, if His Royal Highness does not come as soon as he is able." Madge laughed. "It sounds frightfully important, Captain Trevelyan. Well, we will wait for then. In the meantime, I will take the greatest care of her." He nodded and went off for his flight. Madge waited till he had vanished into the darkness, and then she went upstairs to her own room, where Joey was laying in the little camp bed. "Hello," she murmured, as her sister came into the room. "Go to sleep, Joey," said Miss Bethany severely. "You oughtn't to be awake now. Do you know what the time is?" "Not an idea," yawned Joe. "Oh, I'm so sleepy. Good night." She turned on her side, closed her eyes, and fell asleep. Dr. Jem, who was watching, heaved a sigh of relief and set down a glass of something he had been holding. "Thank goodness," he said in low tones. "I was afraid she would have this to make her sleep. Natural sleep is the best thing in the world for her. Don't let anyone wake either of them tomorrow. They must have their sleep out, and I don't believe they will wake one penny the worse for any of this." Madge nodded. "What a mercy! I was dreading an illness for them both. Are you sure, Jem?" "As certain as I can be of anything. They are both cool and resting comfortably. Elizaveta never troubled me in any case. She's worn out physically, of course, but will probably be fractious and tiresome till she's got over that. But it's only a matter of a few days at the most. Jo, I was worried about. She's such an excitable piece of goods that there's never any calculating how things will go with her. I haven't forgotten the scare she gave us over measles last term." "Neither have I," said the young lady's sister. "It was unlikely that anyone who had anything to do with it would forget. Jo had distinguished herself by running up a temperature of 105 and staying there for 2 days, after which she had returned to normal almost at once, and had been convalescent long before Frida, who had never been over 100, was able to get up. They had a terrible fight those 2 days, and it was held as a joke against the patient. "Keep them both very quiet for the rest of the week," were Dr. Jem's final words as he went off to the Crown Prince Carl, where he was to spend the night. "I'll look in before I go up yonder in the morning, but I don't suppose they will need anything but rest and good food." "Am I to keep them alone, then?" demanded Miss Bethany, following him downstairs. "Oh, if they want a visitor, they could have the Robin or Frida, or someone who can be trusted to be quiet," replied the doctor. "Don't let that imp Grizel Cochrane loose. You might keep Evandene and Margia and the other excitable people away. That's all. And above all, don't let them think themselves heroines or criminals. If they could manage to treat it as an ordinary everyday occurrence, it would be the best of all. I'll do my best. But I'm only human, retorted Madge. It's been a ghastly time, and I can't forget all at once. I know, dear, he replied gravely. I wish I could help you more, but I don't think I ought to stay away from the San Alp any longer, even though I have young Maynard there to help me. He's quite young, and it's a big responsibility for him. He said good-bye after that, and went off, leaving Madge to lock up and then go upstairs to her room, where Joey lay sleeping so profoundly that it seemed as if nothing would wake her. Miss Bethany made haste to follow her example and got to bed as quickly as she could. She was so tired that she fell asleep as soon as her head touched the pillow, and she never moved until Marie came in with a glass of milk for her the next morning. There must be no bells rung, Marie, she told her young mistress, as she sat up and took the glass Marie held out to her. The Herr Doctor says that the young ladies are to sleep till they wake of themselves, and will you tell the other young ladies that they must be very quiet. I will get up now and go to see how Fräulein Elisaveta is this morning. Marie nodded her head and went off gaily to spread abroad the news that the two had returned. Of course, everyone in the school knew that they had gone off in quite a wrong way, but the girls had promised to say nothing about it to outsiders, so Miss Bethany hoped that it need not get round. There were great rejoicings at Frostruck that morning, but everyone was very careful to be as quiet as possible. Joey and Elisaveta slept the clock round and then woke up feeling very stiff and sore, but with nothing else, so far as their bodies were concerned, to remind them of their experience. The princess ate her breakfast and then fell asleep again. Nature was repairing the damage in her own way, and she would be none the worse once she had slept off her weariness. Joey, more excitable, sat up and demanded a book. I'm all right, she argued, only I don't want to get up. I feel nearly as sore as I did when I strained my ankle on the ice the winter before last. I may stay in bed for a while longer, mayn't I? Well, for the present I think it might be as well, agreed her sister, who knew better than to say that she must. That would have been the surest way to set Joey longing to get up. She was provided with a book and another pillow, and then she was left to herself. When Madge came back an hour later, it was to find her small sister buried in the adventures of Little Women and quite happy. How is Elisaveta? She asked as she laid the book aside and looked approvingly at the plate given to her, which the head had brought up. I say, we could have done very nicely with this yesterday, I can tell you. I've never been so hungry in all my life before. It served you right, said Madge, with Doctor's last command in her mind. You were very naughty girls to go off as you did, and I'm not sorry that you paid for it. I shan't punish you any further, but you needn't come to us for any sympathy, for you won't get any. That was all she had said about it, but it was quite enough. Jo had feared that there would be a big fuss. She had feared more that her sister would be very much upset over it all, but to have it treated like a childish escapade, to be told that she was a very naughty girl, as if she had been the robin, took all the gilding off the gingerbread. Elisaveta was treated to the same remarks, with the addition that though she was a princess, it didn't mean that she could go off as she had done. You were trusted to my care, said Miss Bethany with unusual severity, and if you had stayed to think for one moment, you should have known that anything which you were told to hide from me, at least anything so serious as your being sent into hiding, must be told to me first. You didn't give your father and your grandfather much credit for being gentlemen when you believed all that rigmarole, Elisaveta. I'm very disappointed in you. Elisaveta hadn't one word to say for herself. It was all so true. As for Dr. Jim, he roared with laughter when he heard how it had been dealt with. It was just exactly what they needed, he said, when he was grave once more. I imagine they feel horribly small, and will be glad to forget all about it as soon as possible. They stayed in bed for the rest of the week, for they were both bruised and sore with their climbing, and as the others had been warned to say nothing about it to either of them, it was soon regarded to the limbo of the school affairs. Madge hoped that it would never be resurrected again, but she was to be disappointed there, though that came later.